FDA recently published a draft guidance to fresh produce growers and others to help inform them of how they are currently interpreting the produce safety rule. This is a draft guidance, and they are looking to industry to provide comments. The key to making informed comments is understanding what's in the draft guidance and how it differs from what has been published before. This video is the fourth in a series to attempt to shed light on these differences, and will only cover Chapter 4. Chapter 4 of the draft guidance starts on page 57 and covers Subpart F, Biological Soil Amendments of Animal Origin and Human Waste. An important thing to highlight on the first page is that you may not use human waste for growing covered produce, except biosolids treated in accordance with the requirements of 40 CFR Part 503, Subpart D. Page 58 contains a flowchart to help you determine whether or not your soil amendment is a biological soil amendment of animal origin, or BSAAO. Page 59 shows a chart on the application requirements and minimum application intervals for BSAAOs, depending on whether it is treated or untreated. Section 1 elaborates on how to determine whether your soil amendment is a BSAAO. Here on page 60, they define biological soil amendment of animal origin as any biological soil amendment containing materials of animal origin. Some examples of BSAAOs that they provide include manure, animal bedding material or grass clippings that contain animal excreta, table waste, non-fecal animal byproducts such as meat, eggs, or dairy products, or agricultural tea containing biological materials of animal origin. Human waste is not considered a biological soil amendment. Section 2 on page 61 covers the definition of treated and untreated. A BSAAO is considered treated if it is processed to completion to adequately reduce microorganisms in accordance with the requirements of CFR 112.54. The rule does not require you to conduct lot-by-lot microbial testing. For agricultural tea that is a BSAAO to be considered treated, the biological materials of animal origin must have been processed to completion, and the water used to make the tea must be untreated surface water and must have no detectable generic E. coli in 100 milliliters of water. They also cannot contain agricultural tea additives, or else they are considered untreated. A BSAAO is considered untreated if it is not processed to completion to adequately reduce microorganisms. It is also considered untreated if it is contaminated after treatment, combined with an untreated BSAAO component after treatment, or is composed of untreated waste that may be contaminated. On page 62, the draft guidance lists examples of untreated BSAAOs. At the bottom of page 62, the draft guidance provides ways to manage untreated BSAAOs. It's important to note that you may still use untreated BSAAOs to grow covered produce, as long as it is in accordance with the application restrictions of 21 CFR 112.56, which is further explained in Section 3. Section 3 on page 63 helps to determine the appropriate treatment process and associated microbial standard for your treated BSAAO. It's important to note that the microbial standards described in 112.55a and b apply only to determining whether an alternative treatment will be equivalent to the two treatments outlined in 112.54. FDA maintains that individual lots of treated BSAAOs do not need to be tested. As stated on page 64, you have the flexibility to determine the treatment process you use to meet these microbial standards, but it must be validated to meet the standards of the Produce Safety Rule. Here, the draft guidance lists items that validation studies should consider, such as the types of materials that will be used, the density of the materials, the amount of material to be treated, and so on. Here on page 65, the draft guidance says that you should establish procedures to ensure delivery of the scientifically valid, controlled process, administer the process in a controlled manner to ensure the treatment parameters, for example, time, temperature, moisture content, and pH, are achieved throughout the entirety of the material. Ensure the BSAAO is sufficiently homogenized by blending or turning the compost pile, for example, and ensure the treatment parameters are achieved in areas of the material where delivery of the process could be more challenging to achieve, such as the bottom or edges of the pile. Section 4, beginning on page 66, talks about how to apply your BSAAO. There are different application requirements based on whether your BSAAO is treated or untreated, and the level of treatment it received. Part A of Section 4 discusses application methods for untreated BSAAOs. Untreated BSAAOs must never contact covered produce during application. What happens after application will determine time to harvest, or the pre-harvest interval of the application. BSAAOs must also be applied in a way that either A, does not contact covered produce at all after application, or B, minimizes the potential for contact with covered produce after application. As discussed on page 67, some application methods result in BSAAOs contacting the covered produce, such as mechanical side dressing with crops growing on or near the ground. These methods cannot be used to apply untreated BSAAOs when the harvestable or harvested part of the crop is present. The minimum application interval of an untreated BSAAO that does not contact covered produce during or after application is 0 days, meaning you can apply an untreated BSAAO and harvest the covered produce on the same day. For untreated BSAAOs that are applied in a way that minimizes the potential for contact of covered produce after application, the FDA has not yet determined a minimum application interval. The draft guidance states here that the FDA does not object to growers' use of the National Organic Program standard of 90 or 120 days. It's important to highlight on page 68 that there is always a chance that some soil amendment could be present in dust such that it settles on covered produce, but the FDA does not believe that this type of potential contact is significant enough to be considered contact with covered produce. Part B of Section 4 talks about application methods for treated BSAAOs. BSAAOs that are treated to meet the requirements of CFR 112.54a, which is the more stringent level of treatment, may be applied in any manner with a minimum application interval of 0 days. BSAAOs that undergo treatment processes that meet CFR 112.54b, the less stringent level of treatment, must be applied in a way that minimizes the potential for contact both during and after application. The minimum application interval is still 0 days. Section 5 on page 71 covers the requirements for handling, transporting, and storing your BSAAOs. They must be managed in a way that they do not become a potential source of contamination. For example, they should not be stored in locations where runoff from rain could cause contamination of covered produce, agricultural water sources, or other soil amendments. Treated BSAAOs should be handled, conveyed, and stored in a way that minimizes the risk of contamination from either untreated BSAAOs or other sources, such as wildlife intrusion or runoff. Possible examples include covering with a tarp if the location is subject to runoff, or being stored in an enclosed building. If your treated BSAAO becomes contaminated, it must be considered untreated. To minimize the risk of cross-contamination between untreated and treated BSAAOs, you should clean and sanitize equipment previously used with untreated BSAAOs before use with treated BSAAOs. You should also consider dedicating equipment and tools to be used only for activities involving contact with treated BSAAOs. Section 6 on page 72 discusses the records required for treated BSAAOs. If you acquire the treated BSAAO from a third party, you must maintain documentation, at least annually, that 1. The process used by your supplier is scientifically valid and carried out with appropriate process monitoring, and 2. The BSAAO has been handled, conveyed, and stored in a manner that minimizes the risk of contamination by an untreated BSAAO. An example of this documentation is a certificate of conformance. For a treated BSAAO that you produce for your own farm, you must keep documentation that the process controls, time, temperature, and turnings, for example, were achieved. When making comments on the draft guidance, keep several things in mind. Reference the section of the rule you have a particular issue with. Be specific about the issue you are presenting. Avoid ranting. Offer alternatives to interpretation. Remember that the law is not changing or going away. This represents how the government interprets the law. The draft guidance covers all aspects of the produce safety rule except Section E, agricultural water. Public comment on this draft guidance is being accepted until April 22, 2019. Michigan State University Extension encourages looking into this guidance and commenting before the deadline.